Esteemed guests, please welcome President Lee C. Bollinger and the Federal Chancellor of the Republic of Austria, Her Excellency Brigitte Bierlein.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you, members of the Austrian delegation who are here with us today, our moderator, Anu Bradford, the Columbia Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization and Director of the European Legal Studies Center, our co-sponsor, the European Institute, and the many students and faculty that we have here this afternoon. It is really a pleasure to welcome our guest, the Federal Chancellor of Austria, Brigitte Bierlein. Chancellor Bierlein is a celebrated Austrian jurist. She found her calling early, studying at the University of Vienna and receiving her law degree there. She passed the judge's exam at the age of 26 and went on to serve as a judge in civil and criminal district courts in Vienna before moving on to the public prosecutor's office. She worked in the Procurator General's office with the Austrian Supreme Court of Justice, and in 2003, she became vice president of the Constitutional Court of Austria, a post she held for 15 years. In 2018, she was sworn in as the court's president. Chancellor Bierlein was appointed to her current post in May of this year, on the heels of a well-publicized corruption scandal that shattered the country's governing coalition. The scandal and the ensuing vote of no confidence ousted her predecessor, an ascendant politician who had embraced nationalist policies and won Austria's federal elections in 2017. The government led by Chancellor Bierlein will hand over power after new elections are held this weekend. And we are very pleased she has chosen to come to Columbia to reflect on her time as Chancellor and the journey that brought her to serve in this capacity. The recent events in Austria, the upending of the centrist political consensus that had existed for decades, and the rise of right-wing populism reflect broader trends that have been dominating European politics and American politics for some time now. The Great Recession, the sovereign debt crisis, unprecedented migration, Brexit, the officials and institutions seeking to hold the European Union together have been challenged again and again. In the EU parliamentary elections held this past summer, the victors were fragmentation and polarization. Mainstream center-left and center-right politicians lost seats to newer, less conventional leaders. Nationalists gained ground, but not enough to cause the wave that many feared. How will the battle between nationalism and internationalism play out? Seasoned observers can't agree on much except that the period ahead is certainly characterized by uncertainty. Fortunately for us, we're joined today by someone who well understands these forces at play. Chancellor Bierlein is here to talk about, quote, freedom, security, and the rule of law, a European perspective. Please join me in welcoming her. Chancellor Bierlein.
Dear President Bollinger, dear members of faculty, dear students. The fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall 30 years ago are still vivid in my memory. No one who witnesses these events will ever forget the images from Berlin and from the Austrian border with Hungary, where the foreign ministers of Hungary and Austria cut open the barbed wire that had divided their countries for decades. No one will forget the joy that overcame us. We were convinced that Europe's post-war division had come to an end, that Austria was moving closer to the heart of Europe. And we were convinced that free liberal democracies would prevail everywhere. After all, we hoped that democracy, with its fundamental values in the rule of law, was finally set to be confirmed as the noblest and most beneficial form of government in Europe and beyond. Today, we must recognize that this hope hasn't been fulfilled. It is true that Europe is now united with a strong commitment to freedom, peace and justice, respect for human dignity, democracy and the rule of law. At the same time, however, according to the current democracy index, there are still more than 50 authoritarian regimes and almost 40 states with strong authoritarian tendencies worldwide. Not even half of all states represented at the United Nations, not far from here, can therefore be described as democratic, where civil liberties and political freedoms are respected. This is not encouraging. We consider both freedom and security, both public interest and privacy as fundamental rights. On the other hand, there's been particular tension between those rights long before the horrific terrorist attacks in recent decades. 3 days ago, as I visited the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, I paid homage to the victims of those terrible attacks, and I was deeply moved. These acts of terror caused unspeakable suffering. They were an attack in our values of democracy and freedom. However, our efforts to fight terrorism and ensure international peace and security brought the tension between the fundamental rights of liberty and security further to light. Our increased focus on safety, prevention, and surveillance also had an impact on the scope of our privacy and our fundamental right to data protection. Of course, states must be able to fight terrorism and any globalized form of crime by legal means in order to protect our citizens. At the same time, civil liberties of each and every citizen must be protected as far as possible. But what is the right balance between necessary surveillance measures and data protection? Where is the balance between privacy and public interest? Freedom, personal freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, religious freedom, freedom of employment, freedom of elections, minority rights. In other words, all the achievements of a modern constitutional state cannot be enjoyed without democracy and the rule of law. We know that there can be neither absolute freedom nor absolute security. For absolute freedom can ultimately lead to anarchy and absolute security to dictatorship. Freedom and security are fundamental needs of every human being. The European Convention on Human Rights refers to both rights in the same notion. The state must protect the security of the population, but also civil liberties. Today, more than ever, the tension between these two fundamental rights is difficult to resolve. Indeed, the choice of how to strike the right balance between security and freedom remains subject to dispute. And yet, we must find this balance. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, many states took steps to enhance the security of their citizens. This was a perfectly legitimate and understandable choice. But there is need for caution. Our high standards and strong civil rights mustn't be put at stake. In the words of former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, there is no trade-off between effective action against terrorism and the protection of human rights. Let me give you an example of how courts in Europe deal with this trade-off. The concrete question was whether a state may collect surveillance data on virtually to enter a population for a long period of time and without a specific reason in order to prevent crimes. The answer by the European Court of Justice, by the German Federal Constitution Court, and by the Austrian Constitution Court was no. They held that such a serious breach of fundamental rights requires the concrete suspicion of a serious criminal offense. Data may only be stored for a limited period and only with a court order. The Austrian Constitutional Court is currently looking at similar issues like video surveillance in public places or the recording of number plates without a concrete cause. I think this shows the fine line between freedom and security. Over 200 years ago, Benjamin Franklin said that if we give up liberty to gain a little more security, we will end up losing both. But the German scientist and philosopher Alexander von Humboldt said that without security there is no freedom. So who is right? Can there even be a definite answer? I am convinced that we must continue to reflect and discuss. It is one of the decisive questions of our time. And where could such a delicate question be better discussed than in these prestigious halls? There's also a broader question. The law cannot become an instrument of total risk prevention. The concept of preventive security doesn't leave room for standards of liberty and freedom, which we have come to enjoy in liberal democracies. The democratic state is built on the primacy of freedom. This is also what makes the state, as a guarantor of the rule of law and the welfare of its people, legitimate. It is the most important condition for stability and freedom. We accept laws passed by a majority in Parliament. We accept European laws and decisions even in those rare cases where Austria, as a member state of the European Union, may disagree with them. We do not want to live in a country where laws are written on paper but cannot be enforced, where independence of the judiciary becomes an empty word, and where each individual's freedom of choice is being restricted in visible or less visible ways. At the heart of freedom and peace is the democratic rule of law, the opportunity to have a political opinion and the freedom to express it, and the voluntary commitment to exercise this privilege. Democracy is fragile. Fundamental rights cannot be taken for granted. They must be defended day after day. As former President Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. We need to work especially on educating young people about why freedom, security, and democracy is so important for them and why it is worth standing up for them. We need to promote political participation and a sense of belonging. I see many young faces here in the audience, and I feel the commitment, intellect and passion with which you take your future into your own hands. I'm confident that together we will preserve, protect, and nurture our vibrant and resilient democracies. As Karl Popper said, optimism is a duty. I was and have always been an optimist, even if this is not always easy in our turbulent times. And now I look forward to an interesting exchange of views. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Chancellor, for these very insightful, very important remarks. I think you touched on some of the issues that all of us can agree are really defining the society in Europe, but also beyond. And I wanted to build on what you mentioned in the end, that optimism is a duty. So we want to all agree that rule of law in Europe will be upheld, democracy and those structures will be protected. But where do you look for those safeguards and that better path? So we have had a lot of issues with rule of law backsliding in countries ranging from Poland and Hungary, Romania, other parts of Europe. But are you optimistic, and where do you build? Where do you find that optimism?
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you, all of you, for listening to me. You are absolutely right. In Hungary, but not only in Hungary, also in Poland, Romania, in the former Eastern countries, we see a tendency of calling the rule of law into question. The European Union has, of course, recognized this, and the responsible parties have, for the first time, instituted a proceeding against Hungary and Poland because the justices were forced to retire. Age limits, for example, were lowered overnight, and the European Union, for the first time, has instituted proceedings to secure, to review the rule of law. And against Poland, preliminary measures have been taken. Poland observed the rules and has recalled the law that lowered the retirement age of justices. So I am optimistic, of course. Developments just as this in Europe, not only in Europe, are of course cause for concern. And several years ago, I would never have expected that countries that didn't used to be democracies, that these countries are now sort of now have a tendency to again sort of welcome a strong hand, but unfortunately that's exactly the case.
Courts are in a critical role in protecting the democracy and upholding the rule of law. So is it really up to the courts, especially if the politics fails? And if we look at the news from today in the United Kingdom, where it is really the Supreme Court that is now restoring the parliamentary democracy. So how important, or is it really crucial, is it really just the courts that we need to rely on?
Yes, I believe that's the case, at least in Austria and also in Germany, in Central Europe, but not only there. Constitutional courts have this role and this effect. They can suspend laws. For example, in Austria, the Austrian constitutional law is going to celebrate its 100th anniversary. That's one of the oldest constitutional courts and the two European courts. I hope you understand that I'm now focusing on Europe, there's the Court for Human Rights, and the rules, and that court is heard in terms of human rights. There's also the Common Court in Luxembourg, and those decisions are being accepted by the European countries. And I can only talk of Austria. The rulings of the constitutional courts are accepted by the politicians, and of course some politicians see that differently, but the Austrian Constitutional Court 2 years ago, for example, opened marriage, same-sex marriage. The political establishment was hesitant to do that. The constitutional course went ahead, and then the political establishment followed. So I think, I do believe in the jurisdiction of the courts and their leadership role.
Students to line up for questions. Maybe in the meanwhile, I ask you one more question. I think you correctly emphasized this is not just a European issue. All the societies, all the governments need to find the right balance between national security and protecting the individual liberties. In Europe, we've often thought of Europe as being a global leader in showing how that balance is being struck, of leading the world with ideas of protecting the individual freedoms, of trying to strike this balance in light of a very strong commitment to the democratic institutions. Do you feel Europe still today is in a position to set the standard globally and lead the world and societies outside of Europe towards a better balance?
I hope so, yes. We have a high standard of data protection, not just in Austria. This is not the case in other countries, and it's not just the balance between security, protection against terrorist acts and things like that. Of course, governments need instruments in order to deal with these questions, and but this has to be balanced with individual rights, with these rights that we have in Austria, but also in other European countries, of course. And it's sometimes not easy to find the right balance here. And the Constitutional Court has intervened, for example, when data was collected of persons that against whom there were no suspicions. This is a really important question. Data protection is an important issue, and it's sometimes not easy to find the balance.
I wanted to now open the floor.
Jetzt,
questions, so I'm inviting all of you to be brief so that we can get as many topics covered as possible in the limited time that we have together. Do we have students? Can I see maybe the show of hands? Yes, I see there, the first person, and behind. If you can go behind the microphone, please. And maybe the next person can already go behind so that we can... Please go ahead.
Thank you for your
and
words.
Please introduce yourselves before your question, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm Aditya Rajkumar, and I'm a senior. So my question is, Chancellor, thank you for your words. You seem to believe that democracy is universally applicable and preferable. But, for example, I would ask you, for example, does the rise of China and China's ascendancy in the East not, for example, show that perhaps in some cases democracy isn't so preferable, and in some cases it is preferable, like in Europe?
Can we maybe take two questions, and then if you address them at the same time? So then the next one, please.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. I'm Winsao Liu from the Business School first-year student. My question for you today is that, do you think that further integration of the European Union should be either a good thing or not good thing? We see there's a lot of discussion about the unified European monetary fund and also kind of a unified European army. Do you think these are a good direction to go or not? Thank you.
So democracy as a model in different societies, and then the extent to which we should be pursuing integration. Yeah, please.
Ja, auf den ersten.
Yes, maybe to answer the first question, you asked whether democracy is really the ideal form of government. I can only quote Mr. Churchill, who said, you probably have heard this, democracy is not the best of all forms of government, but there is no better one. He said something like this something along these lines, and I would actually underscore that. I think democratic values should be applied universally all over the world. Of course, if you look at China, China is an economically very successful country, but certainly not a democratic government. I think that democracy is the only right form of government for all countries, including the United States, of course. So much for the first question. If I understood you correctly, I don't know whether you said that you mentioned a common currency and common borders, external borders. This is something that, of course, the Europeans should be responsible for, but we don't have a joint a system of securing the external borders jointly. There are some countries who are welcoming migrants, for example. Austria has been a very welcoming country. We are taking in more migrants than any other country with the exception of Sweden. And of course, Nordic countries have less of a problem of accepting migrants from the south or from the east, but it would be important to have a joint to protect the external borders jointly, to have a European system for that. I don't know whether that really is completely responsive to your question.
Catherine Lankes. I'm a graduate student at the Columbia J School, Journalism School. Und ich würde gern wissen, unsere Wahlen stehen vor der Tür. Wie sehen Sie Ihre Rolle als erste weibliche Bundeskanzlerin in der Geschichte Österreichs? Ja.
Did we get the translation for that? So would it like to be the first female chancellor?
Haben wir die Übersetzung bekommen? Ich hoffe.
Yeah, please.
Should I go ahead?
Do you want to take that question first, or shall we take the second question as well? Yes, we can take the second question. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Sabina Solorsino. I'm a senior in Columbia College. It's one of the undergraduate colleges. My question is this. I'm wondering, in an ideal world, what you think the policy on migration should be in both Austria and Europe at large, which you kind of touched upon, but I'd prefer if you expand on it.
Yes, please go ahead.
Ja, vielen
Thank you very much. Well, I guess somebody has to be the first female chancellor. I have had a lot of luck in my life to be at the right place at the right time. As it's often said, I was also the first woman in the General Procure Authority. That's the topmost authority in the Austrian court system. And okay, as the first chancellor, I am very surprised how positively that was received, and not just by women. And I am actually very glad about that. But I think it was high time that this happened, and maybe we should even have a female president at some point. And I'm not thinking of myself, but I believe, my role as the first chancellor is perhaps a certain trendsetter. The second question about migration in Austria, do you mean generally or in Europe, how Europeans handle this question? Is that what you wanted to know?
Also in Österreich, wir
We have in the Human Rights Commission, and which constitutional law, we have certain provisions that do not allow the deportation of people back to their countries when they risk danger to their life. That is being handled very strictly in Austria. We have asylum laws. I mean, if you are talking about asylum, there has to be a reason for seeking such asylum. I mean, we have a refugee convention, an international convention, which Austria, of course, adheres to. Other than that, there is also rights to having a job in another country within the European Union. As you know, there is a freedom of seeking jobs. So I don't recall how many people really work in Austria who were born in another country, but in principle, this freedom of seeking work elsewhere is well regulated in Europe.
Und bitte verzeihen Sie, wenn ich diese Frage dann auf Englisch stelle. My name is Kevin Schwartzwald. I'm a PhD.
Into English. Ich bin interessiert an Ihren Gedanken, wie
caretaker government with the challenges of dealing with the policies that the last government has implemented, many of which seem to go against your own vision for government and Austria specifically.
Great, thank you. And shall we have the second question as well, please?
Hi, my name is Fakhruddin Walika. I'm from Pakistan. I go to the law school here at Columbia. My question pertains to climate change and the threat it poses and all the issues which you covered, from national security to civil liberties to data protection and especially migration. So my question is, what efforts are being undertaken to address this global threat of climate change, and what are your views on it? Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank zur ersten Frage.
Thank you very much. The first question, we are a so-called transition government. You may be familiar with our previous history. Our constitution provides for the president to appoint this transition government, and so we do not necessarily reflect Austria's will as such, so we do not really have a mandate as such. We weren't really elected, in other words. So for that reason, our government is very much making an effort not to make a lot of changes and not to really, pass a lot of fundamental laws, but rather to submit laws to the parliament that prevent damage to the country, or if, there is certain rules that the European Union passes, then we are, trying to adjust those for Austria and make sure that that laws that the European Union passes do not cause any harm to Austria. But a priori, we are not intent on making a lot of new laws. We do not have our own budget either. We have sort of a preliminary budget, which is more or less a continuation of the previous one. And next Sunday, actually, there are new elections, but it will, of course, take a while until a new government is formed. I mean, the party that has the most votes has then to be appointed by the president to form a new government. So it will, of course, take a while. So I will probably still be doing my job for a while. But once the parliament has been elected, and then one should hope that this new parliament reflects the actual will of the Austrian people. So we are also a government of experts rather than just of politicians, which is, by the way, a big difference to other countries. And the second question as to climate change and data protection, etc. Yes, well, climate protection is a subject which in the meantime has been recognized worldwide. Even China is beginning to recognize it. In Austria, definitely all political parties have it on their agenda. Climate protection, which until some years ago was still treated a little bit as an outside problem, but now it has become a focal point, and especially also due to young people's efforts. So it is indeed a very urgent subject. From my point of view, it can only be resolved globally, and I think that is where the difficulty lies. But any step forward is a good step, and Austria is trying. For example, we have no nuclear power in Austria. We are very good in renewable energies. So more and more young people in Austria, for example, do not even drive a car anymore. So here, when I came to New York yesterday, or whenever when I arrived here, I saw all these huge cars on Fifth Avenue and all this congestion. It's just unbelievable to me. But obviously, Austria is a much smaller country, so you can't really compare that. But in any case, there has been an awareness and a change in people's consciousness. But of course, this doesn't happen from today to tomorrow. The business has to change. The economy, has to agree to adhere to certain regulations and so on. But it is, it's a worldwide problem, and not enough has been done. So.
When it focuses on, as you said too, these are global issues that require global cooperation. At the same time, in the recent years, we have seen a massive setback on the institutional structures internationally, and a decline in multilateralism, and decline in the ability of international institutional order to respond to those challenges. So this week you have spent some time at the United Nations, and how do you look at that global cooperation at this point, and how do you look at the future of multilateralism? And if you think about how important for European foreign policy it has been to really work through those institutions to advance the values that Europeans cherish.
I think in the area of science, it has been common for many years. International exchange is obviously the norm. I mean, among students, definitely scientists, and obviously there is great cooperation in Europe. We have the so-called Erasmus program, which furthers exchange between students. I mean, unfortunately, this Brexit issue obviously is taking a little bit of a break to that, and the Erasmus program cannot continue in the way it has been in the past, but hopefully we'll find other ways to further that. So again, in science, this is commonplace, and international cooperation is important, of course, in all areas, especially also in the area of climate change. And I'm rather optimistic after we heard the speeches, not only by Greta Thunberg, but also by General Secretary Guterres. I believe it's an awareness that has become global. Vielleicht wollen wir noch auf das Publikum zurückgehen. Ich glaube, wir haben noch ein paar.
I see that in many European countries and also in America, there's more and more foreign influence during elections. And my question would be, what can the European Union and what can individual member states do to reduce that amount of foreign interference in elections? Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. I'm Sophia from China. I have two general questions. So first one is, you mentioned you are the first female
the most higher position in your country. So my question is, what's your successful experience to this higher position? And another question is, we know you have a legal background, so how do you see the role of law in the globalization? Thank you.
Great, let's take these two questions.
Ja, vielen Dank.
The first question, if I understood it correctly, was what can the European Union do? No. Would you like to clarify the first question, please? Was that a migration question?
To elections, whether that be through social media or through media, that there seems to be a trend where countries out of Europe try to influence elections directly or indirectly. My question would be, what can individual states, but also the European Union as such, do against such foreign interference?
Ja, danke.
So now I understood your question. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, you're completely right. Of course, social media and platforms are more and more influenced by other countries. It's definitely a problem in Austria and elsewhere, because communication can, of course, not always be sourced. You can't always know where that comes from. And young people who have their friends, so to speak, on the internet rather than next door. And what can we do about it? This is a development that definitely we cannot reverse. It has, of course, also advantages. We have to distinguish also between fake news and real truth. At least, research news, and that, of course, is often difficult. Austria is trying to not to put certain things on the internet, but it is sometimes difficult to trace it, and it has already become viral before you notice it. I must say I'm not so sure. I think the young people know that better than others. I am unfortunately not really an expert on the internet. I have to admit that. The second question, as a chancellor, well, I made sure, and the president fortunately agreed with me, that half of the members of my government are female, not only me on the top, but among the 12 members of the government, half of them are female. So that has been the first time that happened in Austria. So let's see whether that's going to be a pattern to go forward. But from my point of view, at least it's a good sign, so that women can have the same functions as men. In any case, that's a first in Austria, so I think we can't say more about that.
If you can weigh in on the second question, the significance of law as your background for leadership. So the student asks what the significance of you having legal training as a background for you to now lead the country. So what is the value of legal training, I might even ask?
I never joined a political party. This was something that I never wanted to do, and I'm used to move in circles of law and in the framework of law. And for the transition, it was actually a good thing, because there are a number of jurists in the current government, and we are used to be very pragmatic, to express ourselves in a very pragmatic way, as lawyers, jurists are apt to do, and we don't want to express ourselves in sound bites and things like that, and that really differentiates from us from political parties. Of course, they also can have experts, and there are certain jurists among politicians, but they always look at their voters, and they also look toward the result of elections, and that's something that we didn't have to do, which was very positive.
Time for a few more questions, so we can take the next one, please.
I'd like to begin by thanking you, Chancellor, for coming to speak with us today. My name is Roshan Settler. I'm a first year here at Columbia College. And a few days ago in the news, we saw that Austria actually blocked a potential trade deal between the European Union and Mercosur. So I wanted to ask specifically about how Austria's shifting its trade policies in light of global climate change. Thank you.
And the second one, please.
Hello, my name is Chris Mandela, and I'm a freshman at the School of General Studies. In my opinion, humanity is in a very precarious situation right now, similar to where we were 80 years ago. So I'm wondering if those lessons are still driving policies to ensure tragedies never happen, like the ones that occurred with Germany 80 years ago.
Do you want to take the first question on the trade policy, both with respect to trade deal with Mercosur and then climate change more broadly as part of the trade framework?
Mercosur wurde in Österreich abgelehnt.
Mercosur was rejected in Austria by the parliament, this agreement to join Mercosur that happened several days ago. Of course, there is world trade, and Austria participates in world trade. We're trading with countries like China, South America, and the Mercosur agreement was not adopted, was not accepted in Austria by the parliament. And the second question I didn't quite understand. You talked about the precarious situation. Well,
I understood that the student wanted to ask for your views on how we can ensure that Europe doesn't repeat the mistakes of its history. That world is in a very precarious place. Can we guarantee the lasting peace given the many threats that the world is facing and Europe is facing?
Ja, also Europa und das
Europe, and I understand, of course, tendencies, the desire to leave Europe, like the Brexit, is something that I don't understand, because the European Union has secured the peace, and that's worth a lot. And I don't understand that this isn't valued more, and that there are countries that would like to leave the European Union, and that there are nationalist tendencies in several countries. There are nationalist tendencies in Europe, that is true. In some countries, including France and other countries in the eastern countries, there is a swing to the right, which is something that I don't understand either. I cannot explain the reasons behind it. I don't understand these tendencies, but it is a sign of the times, unfortunately. Nevertheless, I believe that, or I hope, that we are going to live in democracies, even in countries that where there are developments that give cause for concern within Europe. But I think that the democracy will prevail in Europe. I'm really convinced of that.
2 questions, please.
Thank you, Chancellor. My name is Adi Meyer. I am a first year at Barnard College. My question is pertaining to the recent increases in anti-Semitism in all of Europe. I was wondering why you think this is happening now and what is being done to address it. Thank you.
And then the second question, please.
Thank you, Chancellor, for coming to speak to us. My name is Adit Narula Gupta. I'm a third-year undergraduate student here at Columbia. Do you believe that Austria or Europe has a responsibility to pick up the gauntlet that was so callously tossed aside by the US in advancing or promoting democracy overseas? Particularly, I'm thinking about India with the dissolution of the state of Kashmir, about Iranian-Western relations, and North Korea. Thank you.
Other translation. So, if I may repeat the question so that we can have them translated at the same time to the Chancellor. So the first question, can you hear it? The first question deals with anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and the student was wondering what has driven that trend and what is being done to address it. And the second question was whether Europe was going to assume a more proactive role in the promotion of democracy in different parts of the world, a project that the previous administrations in the United States and different times have engaged in. And especially the examples that were mentioned was Kashmir in India, North Korea with respect to Iran. So just more broadly on how far Europe is willing to export its democratic values in parts of the world where those are missing.
Ja, vielen Dank. Also in Österreich.
Thank you very much. In Austria, not only in Austria, there are strict laws if somebody is exhibiting anti-Semitism. For example, if somebody says something positive about the Nazi period, this is something that that there are laws against such tendencies. I think that these tendencies are not extreme in Austria or hardly noticeable, thankfully. We talked about this before my lecture in our government. Although we don't initiate many laws, we initiated one law that was passed unanimously in Parliament, where the victims of the Holocaust, descendants of Holocaust victims, whether those persons can receive Austrian citizenship in addition to their citizenship, to the citizenship that they currently have. This is something that was passed by the Parliament, and we initiated this law, and that law was passed unanimously. So I think there are a number of actions, initiatives, non-government organizations, for example, NGOs, the National Fund, and other organizations that are very active in combating anti-Semitism and racist tendencies in Austria. And I think also in schools, a lot is being done in order to combat tendencies, anti-Semitic tendencies. A certain problem, of course, are Islamic fundamentalists, but these are extremists, and this is something that we see not only in Austria but also in other countries. What Europe can do with respect to countries, Kashmir, India, and so on, that's a difficult question. As I've heard from our foreign minister, who's also here with me at the General Assembly, and he's also the Minister of Culture, so he represents two ministries, and he told me that Iran is very difficult to approach. Is very closed to outside influence. So Austria is a very small country, doesn't have the same weight as other European countries. So it's very difficult to accomplish things in Iran. It's very difficult to institute democratic ideas because it's a very closed society. But I'm confident that in the future these tendencies may be contained and that democratic rule will prevail also in countries like Kashmir. Of course, it's difficult because these are large regions and large countries with big populations, and the extreme poverty that we see in India also makes it difficult for people to be interested in democratic processes because they have to make a living, they have to secure their daily subsistence. But I'm confident that in the long run democracy will prevail worldwide. That's why
many topics, and with apologies, I know we have a long line and we could continue this conversation for long into the afternoon, but Chancellor needs to take plane back to Europe, so I am afraid our time is up. But I want to extend my sincere thank you for being with us and sharing this conversation with the Columbia community today. Thank you. Thank you.
Danke Ihnen. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank the President, and I wish you, the students, all the best for your studies and for your professional careers. I'm convinced that this is a wonderful university where you have the opportunity to study, that you have a bright future ahead of you. So thank you very much for being here and for listening to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Schöne vielen Dank.
Esteemed guests, please remain seated as we escort Her Excellency and delegation out of the building.